Cypress Company of Lacoochee, Florida. You're about to see a 30-minute film of a way of life that existed up until just a few years ago. What you see may amaze you as to the fact that the way the cypress was harvested out in the woods and the type of labor and the type of conditions that they worked with. However, I believe that you'll find this a very interesting film, and it's also a way of life that does not exist anymore. Cumbersund Cypress Company is no longer in existence, and the big cypress mills of the past have all gone. The only thing that remains are the small band mills that cut small cypress. The huge monarchs of the cypress are a thing of the past. Just for your information, cypress trees were full grown the day that the giant sequoias of California first sprung from the ground. It was not unusual to cut a tree that had been in existence for more than 3,000 years. Relating back to the one that the man just crawled over, it was probably a full-grown tree the day that Christ was born, and it took just a few minutes to cut it down, and has been changed into a way of lumber and a kind of lumber that is almost impossible to find. Of course, there's a few trees left in scattered remote areas that makes it almost impossible to harvest. The crews that you see going into the woods, this is a daily occurrence. Happened summer and winter. Had no regard to time or to rain or to cold weather. And these people that you see working here, everybody at that time worked for roughly 10 to an hour, and they did not work from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. They would probably get up at some very, very early hour and then take off to the woods, and there they would stay until 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon until they finished their cutting, and they'd be picked up and coming home. It's impossible to believe. This is a professional crew that was hired by Mr. Bill McKinstry to film this and to keep a recorded history of the way that cypress used to be. Let me just sit back for just a minute and let you watch what they're doing and how they're doing it. This part was filmed in 1946, and the last part was filmed in 1958, where you will see the last day that the mill was in operation. Fall in. They'll notch the tree on one side, then they'll do their cutting with their hand-driven cross-cut saws on the back side of that notch, and they can just about drive a peg in the ground with where that tree will fall. They were that good. Rough kind of a work, and they used to build their track right out to where they were cutting, and you'll see a steam-driven pile driver driving local timber into the ground, and when it got down to where they could not drive it anymore, or to give them a good bed, they would take a cross-cut saw and cut the top off and then lay their track out on it, and that's where their steam equipment would go that would later on pick up the trees and load them and put them on Cumber's own tree cars to be moved back to the mill. There's discrepancy as to where this actually was. Some say it was in Rutland, Florida, which is up close to Bushnell, and some say it's up at the Crow's Bluff area. I'm not familiar with either area enough to be able to tell you, but what they're doing would have made no difference. They would have done the same thing in either Crow's Bluff area or the Compresco area, which is east of Dade City, or any other area that they were cutting timber. The method was always the same. There's a nice one that's falling. You can see in the butt end, you can see a small cavity that they don't know why those cavities are in cypress, but sometime they would go up through the entire tree, sometime they would stop at a couple of foot. They usually cut those off at the mill. It almost makes you want to cry when you see those great big trees that had stood for 2,000 or 3,000 years take their last dive. Also the ending of an era, too. Overhead loading apparatus, and you'll see the cars right behind it. They would load them on these and then chain them down and take them to the main line, and the main line would pick up by Seaboard Coastline and take them to Lacoochee, where they would put on a sidetrack, and then Cumber's equipment would again pick them up and take them to the mill. This is the 104 engine that was the last working steam engine in the state of Florida. It's now in a museum resting place more or less at Leesburg. There's the 104 there. Makes a beautiful sight, is it? That's not the 104 either. That's a Seaboard Coastline engine, or Seaboard Airline engine at that time, taking them to along the main track back to where they will come into La Coochie. See where they cut the stumps in the past, and then quite often they made their grade right along where they cut the trees. This is kind of a little bit of a rough way to make a living, but I think maybe you'll appreciate the fact that you have a position that was quite better than the working conditions were quite better than what you're going to see. This is rather a large tree they're going to work on this time, and you'll see how they'll do it the same way they've done it in the past, and has probably been done since cypress was first harvested. The man down there is having a little bit of tough footing, and he's also carrying the crosscut, as you can well see. They're doing their notching the same way as you saw it in the past there. They're notching it, and this will be falling into the river, and then they'll float it from there down to their nearest pickup point. And you can see the ring on the trees where the high water marks are too. The high water mark is just below the axe handle there. They'll walk out now and cut the topping out of the tree, which they would leave in the woods, or leave in the river, or leave wherever they cut it. And then, of course, the main log itself is what they would float down to the nearest bridge, or to the nearest area that they would put it out with some sort of mechanical equipment to be loaded onto the flat cars to be hauled back to the mill. First thing you're going to ask is, how about the moccasins? Well, when these men started working, the moccasins made a hasty retreat and got out of their way. These people worked, as I said, in winter and in summer, and they did not ever slack down or slow up. It was a hard way to make a living, but at that time, 10 cents an hour and regular work was pretty well thought of. And this, good or bad, was regular work. Cutting this one underwater, you can well see, and that didn't slow them down. They're holding on to their axe handles. If you notice, they're holding on their axe handles to give them balance both in the water and to keep them from pushing themselves away from their cutting area. Won't say there wasn't gators in these waters, but it appeared back in those days that gators would always move over if they heard man coming. No one fed them at that time, and they knew better than to get in the way of one of those axes or to one of these working crews. Hit a hole every now and then, and you go down below where you'd wear boots. This is the filming crew taking a little break, and of course part of the filming crew was filming the filming crew. This is the 104 coming back in with a full train load of logs. You'll probably never ever, you may see a train load of logs, but it'll never be cypress again. This was in the fall, I would assume, by the way the leaves on the trees are, and the water had been pretty cool at that time. Little red caboose on the back end tells you it's on a main line, which is ACL or Seaboard Airlines at that time. This is a shot in the mill yard where they used to dump them off of the trains, and Then the big skidder back in the back was run by Mr. Joe Hull, or the big crane in the back was run by Mr. Joe Hull. And that crane that you just passed over, which you'll see again, helped dig the Panama Canal and was bought by Cummersons, or at that time the Cummer Cypress Company, at their yard at the Naval Yard in Jacksonville. You'll see the log going up in the mill on the right. On the left is where they send the logs up into the mill for veneer. That's your 104. Beautiful little Baldwin engine, and in a few minutes you'll hear it. This is something that OSHA would always frown upon. But they always did it, and it did it from the time the mill started. That young man would hang by the tongs, and he would ride the tongs from the loading area to the chain, and from the chain to the loading area, depending on what they were doing. This is a view of just the mill. That back in the back was the sawdust house. In the front was the steam chambers where they steamed pine before they sent it over to the veneer mill, and that was a veneer mill just a second ago. This is a panoramic view of Cummer. Sorry the film didn't come out better, but this was taken quite a few years ago, and time has taken its toll on the film. That's the main sawmill there. This is a chain where after they sawed it, they sent it down into the yard. And those are old Ross carriages. That was the original Ross carriage built by the Ross Company, and that was used to haul the lumber in the yard and take it to the different stacks where they would stack it, as you see. Kids used to like those stacks because bats would congregate in the stacks, and we'd try to hit them with cane poles. Never worked out. This is a man riding the chain. I don't particularly know who that was. The next half of this film is taken down in the Everglades, and this was the last cutting that Cummerson Cypress Company ever did. This was a different type of timber, as you can well note. Most of this is what they referred to as pond timber, and had a different size, as you can very well see. The tractors would drag it for 2 or 3 miles from the cutting area through this flat, marshy swampland back into their loading area, which was on a railroad track. Rough working, but it's not near as rough as in the river, working along the side of those rivers. The man in the back there with the striped shirt is Bill McKinstry, and he's responsible for both the first film and the second film. I took these pictures, and Bill would keep looking back to make sure that I was not too far behind and would not get lost in these rather rugged Everglades woods. I made darn sure I didn't get lost too. This kind of timber would not have been cut during the first years of Cummerson Cypress Company. This was kind of a scrapping up operation. This size timber was only taken into the mill after everything else had been pretty well cut out. Now, they did have some big timber there, but it was very, very scattered and very few of them. I'd like to call your attention to the size and the weight of that chainsaw that man is working with there. That was probably one of the first chainsaws and weighed about 10 times of what the modern chainsaws were. Now, he's going to drive that peg in and drop the tree in a particular direction. I think they found it easier than notching, but I'm not an expert enough to know. That's Bill McKinstry again. We're going back into some deeper woods now. The local ecologists would go banana over this type of operation, but it would not take nature but a few years and a couple of good rains until all the marks of this sort of devastation of the natural environment would be removed, and you could never tell, excepting for a few small trails that they'd ever cut in that area. Of course, the stumps would be there as reminders and the trees would turn that quick, but you could not tell environmentally that they'd ever cut there. Two for one on this one. He's hooked two at one time and pulling them out. Obviously, they're hooking 3 or 4 logs together to pull out to their loading area. Didn't take any sleeping pills to get you to sleep after a night of this kind of work. This is back into the loading area where they're loading them on trucks to take to the I apologize for the blip, but I can't help that. They load them on trucks to take back to the railroad, and they would dump them at the railroad and load them onto trains to be pulled from the Everglades up to Lacoochee. This took the best out of equipment and men to keep an operation like this going. It was very, very hard work. People who do this seem to have a knack for it and don't particularly like to change jobs. It's overhead skidder that they use to overhead loading apparatus they use to load them on the trucks. Pretty good load there, but it's all small timber. You'll see some bigger timber in a few minutes, but this is all small stuff and really not a prime grade of cypress as far as cypress was concerned. There's a pretty good sized log there. You can see how they bolstered that loader in the back there with the rails in the middle to keep it from bending when they hooked those big logs. This, by the way, is the last train load of cypress logs that was ever loaded and pulled across the track in Florida. When this load reaches the Lacoochee Mill, that will be the end of an era that I doubt will ever come back. And there she is. That's the last, not the completed train, but most of the completed train of logs. The gentleman there in the front is a foreman, and I'll have to admit I've forgotten his name over the years. Bill McKinstry again, who's responsible for both of these films, the first one and this one. That's the 3-spot, I believe there, the original 3-spot, if I remember right. And that train that you're looking at on the end of those cars, the last time that it was officially used, besides this, it was used in the winds over the Everglades with Burl Ives. If you remember the train that was in that, that's the train. They came down to Florida, fixed it up, painted it up, doctored it up, made it look pretty, and pulled it for its last, the last picture show of that area. That's a homemade donkey that you see in front there, yellow and black. That was probably one of the first diesels that was ever used at Lacoochee. It was not factory built. It was built by a bunch of mechanics, and it's diesel powered. It was used mainly just to do what you see doing there. It would pull usually 1 and sometimes 2 cars, depending on the weight and the level of the road, from one area to the other, rather than crank up the steam engine. There's your little engine. That's the 7 spot. I think I called it the 3. That is the 7 spot. That's the one that was in winds over the Everglades. This is their compound, I'd call it, down in the Everglades, and I just took a panoramic view of the area in which the crews lived and which the foremans lived and where all their equipment was maintained. Those little shacks were built in La Coochie and were moved wherever they had a job, like that old T-Bird we just went by. Not very appetizing place to live, but that's where they lived and that's where they worked for all the time they were in the Everglades. Very rough, basic living, and they had more mosquitoes and bugs than they had anything else. This is a depot in La Coochie and this is a register. This is a red register bringing in a load of logs from, I believe, the Chase of Whiskey. They were still logging down there and they had some pretty good timber. This is the last train load, folks, that you'll ever see in Florida. Good or bad as far as the pictures go, this is it. It's the last load of cypress that'll ever come into a mill. Of course, it'll be the last one ever come into the La Coochie mill because it's gone. Both depots are gone now, and of course both tracks are gone. They're backing it into the Cummer siding, and then at the Cummer siding, the 104, which is in La Coochie at this time, we'll pick it up from here and take it on down to the mill where it will be unloaded. Photography wasn't too great in spots, but luckily it doesn't last forever. That's the 104. She's hooked onto them and taking them up the grade to the mill in La Coochie. That was a beautiful little Baldwin, and one I told you about that is up at Leesburg now. This is taken from Mr. Joe Hull's crane there. We got on the side of the crane. I didn't get Mr. Hull. I wish I had of it. He ran that crane for some 30 years. They're back them into place where they'll unload them. The man you see there with the white shirt is Mr. Charles Bergstresser from La Coochie. He was superintendent of the crate mill for, well, I guess since it began, as far as I know, and he had come down to the area to watch this last load come in. This is a panoramic view of the old Cumberson Cypress Company's commissary and their gasoline area, a few of the houses. Then we'll swing across to the water tank that's still in La Coochie, by the way. Not in use, but it's still there. That happens to be the crate mill. A couple of the trucks. And this is the pay office area here. That's the pay office. That we got a view of that too. Cummer paid in cash. They never paid with checks. Every week they paid all their employees with cash. Quite a day. This is a mistake here. I think somebody took a picture of our office in Dade City at that time and didn't know I had the camera loaded up for this. This comes that free ride again I showed you before, and he's still doing it. If you notice, he'll wiggle his feet, makes a semicircle, and that takes the continuing pressure off of his arms and makes it easier for him to hang on. And that's literally hanging on for dear life. He's hooking a rather large log now. This is several days later, and Bill McKinstry saved back a couple of the larger logs to go through the mill to be the last one to go through. And this is, I believe, the last one as it's being hooked to go up on the chain that will take it into the mill. Log probably 3,000 years old, 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Otis Clark ran the little steam engine, or little steam loader back in the back for many years. Notice that yard, for the first time in the history of that mill, is now barren and bare. They knew this was coming, but nobody ever believed it. Got to have our picture taken for this, haven't we? Okay, if you'll notice just 1 second, Mr. Joe Hull will blow that. See that steam coming out? He's calling it quits. That's his final swan song, and he'll cut that crane down and be later sold and I think scrapped out. This is in the mill itself. The big logs would go in, and that little baby right there would come down and cut them into whatever lengths board that they wanted out of that log. That's quite a little size log there. You saw you're in this with Mr. Lynn Burnsett. Mr. Burnsett is still up in La Coochie, and you can see by the size of that log you've got a good cut coming out of her. He operated that 30-foot bandsaw. The man on the carriage there would ride back and forth and do 1,000 miles a day and go nowhere. It was his job to turn that log whichever way the sawyer would call for it, and to set the size of timber, the thickness of the timber to be cut. The sawyer will give him a hand signal as to what he wants to cut out of the log, and it's up to the man on the carriage to turn that log with those steam dogs, as they call them, to whatever cut he wanted. This is Jesse Stanley. Jesse Stanley was with the Cumber Company for many, many, many years. Lynn Burns again, and he's sizing that log up real good. See him hold his hand up there? They're both verifying what kind of cut he's going to get on the next one. Just notice the size of that log and the grain in that cypress. That's a very pretty log. Sawyer's hand never stopped. He's trimming the log up there, but if you'll notice, that hand never stops. He's riding the saw back to shape up his log and clean it up for the next cut. This is a gang saw. He'd cut them up into whatever size timbers you wanted, one by whatever it was, and he'd run it through that gang and cut them all at one time. Got some of the people in the mill, they're standing around. They know that this is it, and at end of their livelihood for one thing, and also end of a era for something else. You saw you here is Bill Searles. Bill Searles sawed for many years out there on that saw, and some of the excitement that comes with his job is when that 30-foot bandsaw breaks, and it slices all over that mill like a mad snake. Everybody starts ducking and dodging. Beautiful 1-inch boards coming out of that. Bill was quite proficient at his job, and I guess you classify him as one of the best. Mr. Rickard there, and I flashed by a couple of others that I wish I'd slowed down on now. Mr. Rickard was in many years there. This is all the people waiting around for this last day to come to its inevitable end. Bill cutting that log like he had 1,000,000 before it in his usual efficient manner. He also realizes that he's coming to an end of an era. There she is. Now this is the last cut. When you see this one drop and that main one that one of the hooks go, that will be the end of the cutting at the Cypress Mill in Lacoochee, Florida. He held his fingers up for his cut, and he's going to yank it off now and put it on the chain. And that's the last board. Kind of hard for you sitting in the audience to realize just exactly what's happening, but to those that lived so close to Lacoochee and so close to that mill, it's a rather traumatic experience. I'll have to admit that. Going through there, they're trimming it up now, and then this is the trimmer. Cut it up, cut the end into whatever length they wanted, cut off the waste pieces. That's Mr. Jace McIlvaine, and you'll watch just a second. He's grading that board, and when you see him make that slice and wipe his hands, you'll know that was it. That's the end of the cutting in there. All of those that are around there are just waiting. And we thank you for spending a few minutes of your time to watch this, rather, those from Lacoochee thing. You're about to hear the sound recording of the 104 engine made several years ago in Lacoochee. Engine and the sound both, or the sound and the engine both speak for themselves.
The date is September the 26th, 1955, and we've come to Lacoochee, Florida today to record some sounds of one of the few remaining steam locomotives to be found anywhere in Peninsula, Florida. Here at the Cummer Sons Cypress Company, through the courtesy of Mr. J.T. McKinstry, we're going to record the sound of Prairie Type locomotive number 104. The engine has just come up here from the yard, and in a moment will back down into the Seaboard Interchange yard, where they will pick up a few loads of logs and bring them back up the hill. So let's stand by. All six of them. Let's climb aboard and ride down the other side of the hill with him to the unloading point. Come down here from the mill, down here into the bottom near the river, where the log loader is unloading a few cars of logs. So we'll just stand by for a little bit and listen to the loader working.
That's Otis Clark on the loader, by the way. Otis Clark. Some say it's the 26th and some say it's the 27th, but anyhow, we're here at Wacoochee, Florida, at the Color Sun Cypress Company today to make some sound recordings of a little steam engine they got here. And Mr. Webb, the engineer, has coupled onto a flat car and brought us down here to into the bottom by the river where they're unloading some logs. Mr. Webb, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about this engine, how long they had it and when it was built and so on.
Yes, sir. Approximately, we've had the engine here around about 23 years on the job here in Wacoochee.
This one they had over at the Crow's Bluff, did they?
One of them over at Crow's Bluff, pulling the main line off over there. Then they hid the switch engine in here, brought it over here and repaired it a little bit and put it on the yard here and unit here.
That's what they use it for now, switch cars at the mill.
Exactly.
They don't go out in the woods with it anymore.
We have no more track in the woods. As far as track goes in the yard.
What are these fellows' names that's working with you here today?
Well, my fireman, his name is Clifford Doctor.
Clifford Doctor?
And Brakeman, his name is Benjamin Lewis. They're both colored boys.
Well, we've got a pretty full crew here today. Well, I guess that's about the story on the engine, and we listened to the... Oh,
Can I interrupt a minute, George?
Old Joe Hogan's got a word to say.
Let the fireman tell us his name.
My name is Clifford Doctor.
And the brakeman tell us his name.
Benjamin Lewis. Benjamin Lewis and Clifford Doctor?
Clifford Doctor, yes.
What, is it much of a job firing this engine?
No, it's quite easy.
Is it a good steamer?
Yes, sir.
They use coal around here.
Yes.
Well, supposing we wrap this up now, and maybe we'll take a little ride back up the hill towards the mill.
Florida backwoods man. Like me, that is come before him, makes his living off the land. Mind's his own damn business, but it'll help you if he can. I was cruising old Highway 90 in the heat of a July day. I seen an old Jimmy broken down just east of Bonifay. I was the driver of the ride, racer with a son, make it worth your while. I said I was on vacation, just out to clear my mind. I'd left my watch in Tampa, I was impressed at all the time. Said Tampa's on my way from here, I've never been south of Perry. He stopped to take a sip from a pocket glass he carried. So he offered me that bottle, saying this here ain't store-bought, but it's good for what is your arthritis, if you can call it. So being the fool that I am, well, I take some big old sip, then turns out not to burn him with the flames from my lips singing.
Sometimes it ain't so bad, sometimes it ain't so good. I takes it all in stride, cause my limbs in the woods. Ain't got much crime or violence, and we never had no drugs. But the wind comes through the pines and makes some jars and gallon jugs.
He said that's Jackson whiskey, been making it 100 years. I was trying hard to hear him through the buzzing in my ear. He said you got to learn to sip it, son, it sets you right on fire. I figure it's about 109 proof and it just don't get much higher. By now I'm breathing normal again, in fact I was feeling fine. First time my sinuses had been clear since 1969. He started looking around my van when he noticed my guitar case. Said you have to do us a tune when we get out from my place. Said life gets pretty busy with a wife and 7 kids, but I've never had to look back twice on anything I did. If my family's needing something or I'm liking a little cash, I just runs off in the pines and I runs a little sour mash singing.
Sometimes it ain't so bad, sometimes it ain't so good. I takes it all in stride, cause my limbs in the woods. Ain't got much crime or violence, and we never had no drugs. But the wind comes through the pines and makes some jars and gallon jugs.
That crossroads more just a place on the map than it was any kind of a town. I might as well been blindfolded for all the roads that led me down. Well, finally came to Grayson's place out in the old pine woods. I realized that in 100 years the Jacksons had done good. As if he could read my mind, he said I'd better explain. We got a lot of money when they needed our land for the train. But Daddy never let it change himself. Man needs to work for a living. Who want anything more than what this land's been getting? So we put the money on back in case kids ever want to get away. Good enough for my dad is good enough for me, so I just reckon I'll stay singing.
Sometimes it ain't so bad, sometimes it ain't so good. I takes it all in stride, cause my limbs in the woods. Ain't got much crime or violence, and we never had no drugs. But the wind comes through the pines and makes some jars and gallon jugs.
I stayed with them almost a week, by then I could understand why a man with $1 million still scraps a living from a man. He had 7 kids that loved him and his wife said paid well. I tell you, if it got any better than this, and God would have kept themselves singing.
Sometimes it ain't so bad, sometimes it ain't so good. I takes it all in stride, cause my limbs in the woods. Ain't got much crime or violence, and we never had no drugs. But the wind comes through the pines and makes some jars and gallon jugs. In northern Florida, not far from Alabama, lives Grayson Jackson. He's a Florida backwoods man. Like his daddy's done before him, makes his living off the land. Mind's his own damn business, but it'll help you if you can. Don't worry about that, just play another thing.
Well, I was going to tell you all about a song from the Florida song, but we opened